Hello, everyone. Welcome to day two of our test prep for AZ104 for Azure Administrator Associate. So let's look at the topics that we are going to cover in day two. So for day two, our focus will be in Azure networking. As you already know from our conversations of day one, Azure networking does cover a large portion of the questions. These can be direct questions or indirect questions. But the key thing to remember is that networking is a very important part of understanding Azure as well as administering an Azure environment. Therefore, you will have a lot of questions that directly address different types of networking features and components. And you may have indirect questions where you need to have good understanding of Azure networking. Therefore, we are going to focus today entirely on networking. As time permits, I will try to do some demo for you as well as go over some of the typical questions related to Azure networking. So let's get started. Let's go over the topics for exam. And as I mentioned before, when choosing the topics for exam, just make sure before your exam that you again go to the Microsoft site and you go and find the actual exam from the Microsoft site. It's the same place where you're going to register. And you basically click the option to review the topics for exam. I'll show this on day four, where to go to find the topics of the exam. But the reason I emphasize it because I am going over these topics. This is something I actually reviewed at the beginning of this presentation this morning. And this can change 2 months from now, 6 months from now. So just make sure that you have the most current information. So the topics for this exam first will be configuring virtual network. This part consists of configuring virtual network and virtual network, also known as VNet, peering, DNS, and how different routes come to play. You will also learn about configuring secure access to virtual network. This will consist of NSGs, different rules, bastions. We'll also talk about load balancing with Azure Virtual Network and monitoring virtual network. One other component that is not mentioned here that we are going to discuss is VPN and ExpressRoute, which is very critical when you are extending your Azure Virtual Network to your on-premise environment and certain third-party environments. So we'll discuss that. Let's now start with the basics, that is, what is Azure Virtual Network? So in this first video, we'll talk about Azure Virtual Networking. We'll learn about Azure Virtual Networking different features, as well as the basic core components of Azure Virtual Network. We are all very much familiar with physical networks that connect different workstations in a corporate environment or any networked environment. This connectivity between different workstation can be something as simple as workstations are connected to a hub, and which ultimately connects to a server, and you can and that server can be a file share, or these are just workstations that are connected so that you can communicate between the workstations. But physical network connects through a cable, and you have other different types of hardware. Virtual network extends these capabilities by using the Azure network management tools that comes with Azure subscription. With virtual networking, you can connect different Azure resources and virtual machines so that they can interact with one another. Just because you are creating the virtual machines in Azure Cloud does not necessarily mean that by some backend magic, they're going to automatically talk to one another. You actually have to configure the networking component in Azure. When you are configuring these virtual networking components in Azure, what you are really doing is in the backend, you are telling different Microsoft resources how to talk to one another when it is actually related to your core environment. So you're building your environment and then you are building your network, and basically you are configuring how different parts of your component, even though they are hosted in Azure, how they're going to talk to one another. So the entire goal is to make sure that you have more control over the configuration and security of your Azure resources and how they communicate. So when you're creating Azure Virtual Network, you have the ability to create different virtual networks that are isolated from one another. Each virtual network will have its own private IP address space, and also you can segment the IP address out into more subnets. You at least have to create one subnet, and we will go over the demo and you'll see how it is done. You can also use Azure's native name resolution service, such as the Azure DNS, to basically make sure that there is a DNS for name resolution. You can use a third-party DNS solution. You can use your on-premise DNS solution, or you can actually set up a DNS server in Azure. But the point here is that just like in your on-premise environment, you can basically create a segmentation of your network. You can do the same in Azure. So how do you use Azure Virtual Network to talk to other resources? Well, the typical Azure Virtual Network can talk to other virtual network. So you can have a resource group where you have Azure Virtual um, Network um, created, and that basically is created to connect your resource group to one another, so that any workstation that connects to that resource group, for example, this resource group can be a front end that takes some information, and in the back end you have SQL servers, and the virtual network actually connects the workstations that are going to be querying this database. So you can have that whole thing in one resource group. And let's just say that you have another resource group that has another app that also communicates with this the SQL backends in the first resource group. So in that case, you are going to create a VNet to VNet um, communication so that the two resource group can talk to another. The other option can be that you have users who are actually on the internet. So you have external users who are querying your front end to retrieve some information that is in your secure backend. So in that case, you'll configure the VNet so that it can talk to the internet. Last but not the least, you can configure your VNet to talk to your on-premise network. This usually happens when you have a hybrid environment, meaning that you still have some of your infrastructure in your on-premise environment, and you started to shift some of your infrastructure in the cloud, or you have your newer infrastructure in the cloud. To summarize, in this video, we have just introduced you to the Azure Virtual Networking in order to have a networking capability, which basically means in order to communicate with the Azure resources, you have to configure networking. And that is the whole idea behind Azure virtual network. It allows communication within Azure as well as outside. Of course, there is different types of routing and filtering of the network traffic that is available, which we are going to delve into. I'm going to do a brief pause before diving into the next chapter. So if anyone has any questions, please post it right now. All right. So we are back, and in this module, we are going to talk about virtual network peering. We already talked about how VNet to VNet can talk to one another, and now we are going to delve into how you can create those VNet peering. So our goal for this lesson will be to learn about network peering. We also want to talk about the VNet transitivity. So is it transitive or non-transitive? We'll have a deeper understanding. We'll also talk about IP address spaces for network peering. So, as the name suggests, VNet peering connects two virtual networks together. I also want to make sure that we'll be using the terminology VNet a lot. VNet simply means Azure Virtual Network. So, going forward, I'll probably be using VNet terminology instead of saying Azure Virtual Network. So, anyway, VNet peering allows different resources within the every VNet to communicate with one another. So, what are the scenarios? It can be that in your organization, you have two virtual network in the same region. However, it also can be that in your organization, you have one resource group in one region. For example, you can have one resource group in North America. You can have a different resource group in let's just say in Europe, and now you have two different resource groups in two different regions. However, just like your on-premise environment where you connect all your corporate environment through WAN, here you will connect it through global VNet peering. You can also connect two virtual networks in two different subscription using VNet peering. And we touched briefly about having different subscription. This can be dictated by different billing mechanism in your environment. So what type of VNet pairing is not allowed? You cannot have VNet pairing with overlapping of network address blocks. So that is not allowed. So for example, if you have, when you are creating your virtual network, you have to set up your address space. So if you have a virtual network with 10.0.0.0/16, you cannot peer with another virtual network with 10.0.0.0/24 because it has IP addresses overlapping. Similarly, if you have two different networks, as shown in this example, 10.1.2.0/24, um, which is a completely different address scheme compared to 172.16.0.0/24, you can pair those two networks. So you have to pay attention to your IP address scheme. And that is something just like your on premise environment, you have to plan out. So it's not something that, I mean, for our testing purpose, we can go in and choose something simply to configure, but you have to give your network address space when you're configuring your Azure VNet equal amount of attention, if not more, when you configure your address space and subnets in your on-premise environment. So basically, you lay it all out. Use pen and paper or Excel spreadsheet, however you want to do this, right? So you want to make sure that okay. in every resource group, how many virtual machines do I need, as well as also something that I have not mentioned in the slide deck. Just keep in mind that for each resource group, Azure also requires some address specific IP addresses, depending on depends on what you enable. But usually, the recommendation is to keep 4 IP addresses specifically for Azure so that it can use it for connectivity to other services as well as connectivity within the resource group. So, what that really means is that for each resource, let's say you determine that you need 32 workstation in this resource group. So make sure you choose a address scheme that allows for more than 32, so 32 plus 4, 36 at least, if not more, when you are choosing your address scheme. So let's talk about transitivity. Keep in mind that VNet peering is non-transitive. Let look, let's take a look at this particular diagram to understand what we are saying. So in this diagram, VNet A, which is 10.1.0.0/16, has a peering with a VNet called Hub VNet. This VNet can be a VNet that is in your corporate environment. And as you can see that this VNet also has a VPN gateway. So this particular VNet is 10.3.0.0/16. So there is no overlapping. So it can actually have peering with this particular VNet. On the other hand, VNet B is 10.2.0.0/16. It's a different VNet. Let's just say it can be for a separate resource group, and it is also allowed to peer with the hub VNet. Now, since VNet A is peering with hub VNet and VNet B is peering with hub VNet, that does not mean that VNet A and VNet B are now peers. So if you want resources from VNet A to directly talk to resources in VNet B, you actually have to create peering between VNet A and VNet B. It is not transitive. So that is one of the key things to remember as you design your environment. So while you are designing Azure VNet environment, it is also helpful to have this type of diagram so that you know how you are designing your environment and how you're creating your VNet peering. This is especially helpful when you have a larger environment. For smaller environment, it becomes very easier as you look into the Azure interface. But for larger environment, I would recommend having some sort of Visio diagram or similar diagram laid out before you create your VNet peerings. So to summarize, we are creating VNet peering to connect virtual network. The recommendation is always to work with a hub and spoke topology that is easy to understand as well as it is easy to configure. Also keep in mind that the security features are already there in virtual network. When we go through the demo, you'll see that how we can configure different security features. Um, Looks like we have a question from LinkedIn. What is the major difference between virtual network and physical network? Um, the major difference, as the name implies, is that with physical network, you are dealing with physical devices and components. So, for example, you have to buy your different network hub and physical cables and all that. With virtual network, it's all virtual. Basically, you're going to use the Azure interface. Um, so that kind of just a no-brainer. However, if you are looking for more, um, go into more into feature specific differences, I think that with virtual network, the biggest difference is that you have already lot of built-in features that you do not get with physical network. So what we mean by that is that when you are uh, creating a physical network, you kind of have to do everything from scratch. You have to, as you configure the physical network, then you have to go to your DHCP to assign your addresses and so forth. And you have to configure all your security features and firewall features and stuff. You can do all of these in Azure as well, but there are a lot of built in features that come directly with Azure as you create your virtual network. And on top of that, you can add additional features. So I would say that that is the biggest difference in between physical and virtual network, along with the fact that when you are creating a virtual network in Azure, you are actually paying attention to already the resource group and resources that you have. So in other words, when you're creating physical network in an on-premise environment, we kind of basically um, build our network as we go, right? So you can have a on-premise environment with just 50 users, have just one server, but then your organization grows, you add stuff. Whereas in Azure, you kind of had to plan it out from the very get-go. So you kind of have to plan out your resource group, what resources are going in, and then you're creating your virtual network, and then you're creating your VNet peering, assuming you have more than one virtual network. So Azure does require you to do some more planning, which actually creates a more solid network, in my opinion. And also, it has more features as well in terms of security, as well as maintaining your network availability. So, good question. So just to complete the summary, want to just also just stress the fact that VNet peering and does not allow transitive peering. So basically what that means is that you have to basically create VNet to VNet direct peering. You cannot just assume that hub and spoke gives VNet peering to all the spokes. All right, I'm just going to pause for a brief moment before diving into VNet security groups, just to see if there are any questions or anything. So if you're listening and if you have any questions, now is a good time. All right, let's start with VNet security groups. As we mentioned before, VNet security groups are important in terms of securing your network. Microsoft Azure VNets already have certain built-in security features. However, you may want to have more control over your security features. And this is where security groups come to play. So our goal for this particular lesson will be to understand what we mean by security groups. We also want to understand network security group assignment and evaluation. How are we going to basically assign these network security groups? And also, we want to understand the settings and security rules. So network security groups filters the traffic the which passes through them based on defined rules. Um, I'm just going to pause quickly and just to answer a couple of questions. One was, can we connect two VNets from different region? Yes, you can connect two VNets that are in two different region. That is a very common for a global environment. And then another question is, so how much virtual how I guess the question is, how secure are virtual networks? Virtual networks are by default are secure in the sense that Microsoft Azure does filter out a lot of the typical common DDoS attacks, and as well as attacks, common attacks that are searching for open ports and stuff. You don't really, so basically, uh, it is your ports are already secure that are commonly used, such as your RDP ports and stuff. However, on top of it, you want to also secure your environment, simply because when you are installing a virtual network from Azure perspective, it is not really known like what you are going to install in the back end, right? So, for example, the ports that are used by SQL Server could be open by default, but if you're not using SQL Server, maybe you want to close those ports. It's entirely up to you. But all I can say is like the basic network security is already there, and on top of it, you have to configure your security, and that is especially true when you are configuring your VNet to connect to the internet. If your VNet is configured to talk to just another VNet, then there are less concerns about security. However, if that other VNet connects to a resource that is already connected to the internet, then you have to pay attention to security. Which brings us back to network security groups, or NSGs. So NSG is where you actually add more security. This is where you are going to create different rules. Just like if you go to even just a very simple Windows 10 and you open the firewalls, you can see that you have rules that says what is allowed and not allowed. NSG has the same principle. It basically, you are creating rules, but these rules are for your VNet. It's not for your specific server or for a specific workstation. So let's look at the NSG properties. So NSGs have the five different core properties for determining an action. So it looks at the source, basically source IP, and the source port. It looks at the destination and the destination port, as well as the protocol. So what that really means is that you can define rules based on that. So, I mean, just to give an example, you can think of like, okay, if it's coming from the internet, like how can you filter based on source IP? So, obviously, it's not. I mean, in that scenario, your destination port and protocol will be of main concern. However, when you are configuring VNet to VNet, you can actually set rules based on source IP and source port, as well as you can do it destination IP and destination port. So if it is for a specific type of network traffic that you want to allow between two different, let's just say, virtual networks. NSG rules are also stateful. What that really means is that if traffic in one direction is allowed, traffic in the opposite direction is allowed by default. So you can actually assign the NSGs directly to the network interface or a subnet. So when you are creating your virtual machines, you can configure, basically, you'll have a virtual NIC, and of course, as we talked about, when you create your virtual network, you have a subnet, and you can create these rules and you can assign these rules to the NIC or to the subnet. In most cases, though, you are assigning the rules to the subnet. If you have a server which you want to add some additional protection, in that case, you are assigning the rules to the NIC. However, um, in most cases, though, if you have a server, those are in most admins do prefer to keep their server. For example, let's just say you have your SQL backends. You want to keep your SQL backends in one resource group, and it is which has one specific VNet. Um, and then you can assign your NSG rules in that VNet instead of going to specific NICs. This can add administrative overhead if you're assigning NSG rules to NIC. However, there are a lot of scenarios as well as a lot of applications that recommend assigning rules to the NIC. So it just depends on the application and what you're trying to do. I'm just giving more or less a in general recommendation. To summarize, in this video, we talked about how network security group works. We talked about how network security groups filters traffic like a firewall to determine what can or cannot enter a subnet, or if you have assigned the rules to the NIC, what can or cannot go to through the NIC to your server. NSGs are stateful, means that traffic is allowed inbound. If the traffic is allowed inbound, it's also allowed outbound. And NSG rules are first come, first serve in priority. So make sure that you prioritize the rules. And also, it's also a good place to make sure that you don't have conflicting rules, which can cause very unexpected results. So that's what that is not what you want to do. So want to pay special attention. So what I mean by that, don't have a rule that blocks HTTP traffic from port 80 and have another rule that actually allows HTTP traffic from port 80. So just figure out what your application needs and create rules accordingly. And last but not the least, NSG uses the 5-tuple information such as source port and IP, destination port and IP, and protocol to create the rules. We're going to pause here to see if anyone has any questions. All right, now we are going to move on to Azure Bastions. Azure Bastions are really another great feature for security. I think we are all familiar with Bastions. It's just that different people use different terminology. So let's take a look what we mean by Azure Bastions. So in this module, we'll talk about Azure Bastions. We'll also understand different features and functionalities. So Azure Bastion is nothing but a jump server that is in Azure. So I think that if you have ever done administration in somewhat or a highly secure environment, you are familiar with jump servers, especially considering the fact that um, we are seeing a lot of it's always in the news that this environment got compromised, and then with all the somebody was trying to configure something, and then they forgot to log out, and then somehow hackers got in and data was compromised. So all of these issues, like whenever I see it in the news, I'm kind of thinking, why isn't there a jump server, or why isn't there a Azure Bastion server? So this is the issue that it addresses. All right. Sorry, I paused for a second because there was a question. And the question was, when asking about cloud computing, cloud SIM security, how secure it is. Um, I'm actually not. Um, I'm not actually clear about the question. Is it? Um, so I'm going to go back to that question after I do present. But if you can clarify what you mean by SIM security, then I can definitely address that question. So okay, so let's go back to Azure Bastion. So Azure Bastion, or you can call it a jump server as well. Um, it is what it is. You can call it anything you want. Um, so basically, the underlying concept is that instead of logging into your SQL server to manage SQL server, instead of logging into your domain controller to manage your domain controller, you have a server for administration purpose, which has secure connectivity with your applications. So admins log into a server or a workstation, doesn't really matter. Basically, a interface that is not on the actual server, right? And it only lets you do certain administrative tasks, and that is the underlying, and only to certain people, right? So that is the connectivity that you have with Azure Bastion. So how does it uh, provide secure connectivity? What it means is that it secures the remote connection over TLS. So let's say I'm an admin, I'm going to manage an organization's SQL server. I have to first connect to the SQL server that is hosted in Azure Cloud. So in order for me to do that, I have to connect to Azure and then double click, open the virtual machine, and then connect, right? Instead of doing so, I will not be allowed to connect to the SQL server. For that particular resource group, there will be a bastion, and that connection will be over TLS. And I will be accessing the bastion server. I can access the bastion server over RDP or SSH from anywhere, and the bastion server will connect to other virtual machines, in this case, maybe the SQL server, over private IP. So this Azure Bastion is actually a managed service. What that really means is that Microsoft Azure manages all aspects of Bastion server. How you have you can configure certain things, but creating the Bastion server as well as installing operating system and whatnot is actually done by Microsoft. So you don't have to put up a server, install operating system, that type of thing. It's all done for you. Then you can do certain configuration, as well as maintenance of the bastion is also done by Microsoft. So how it works is that you have a secure connection. You can think of it as a secure bridge to your um, applications, as well as to your servers that you don't want others to access. Traffic is initiated from Bastion server to target virtual machines, stay within the VNet or peered VNet, but it always stays within the private network. Bastions actually do not need any network security group because they are already security hardened. What that really means is that there is no need for you to create custom rules and trying to allow this and that, because bastions already know uh, what to allow. Basically, it's security hardened. It doesn't really allow anything other than the network traffic that is absolutely necessary for your application. Bastions are already pre-configured uh, to prevent port scanning or on internal networks of the virtual machines. However, Azure Bastion does have limitations in terms of concurrent connections. Your RDP connections are 25 sessions and SSH connections are 50 sessions, which usually is plenty for administering any type of application environment. You just have to make sure that the connections are timed out after a certain time so that if anyone forgets, they are timed out. To summarize, we talked about bastions and how they are a security control. We also talked about how bastions can be used to minimize public access to your virtual machines or your VNet. I cannot stress this enough. A lot of the things that you see on almost seems like a daily basis, perhaps because I pay so much attention to it. Security breaches, data breaches, and hacks that happen um, that actually could be avoided if there was a jump server or bastion server. In addition to the security features that we talked about, um, the Bastion server access can also be monitored. There's a question about how secure and what security feature do Azure Bastion offer. We kind of already touched base about Azure Bastion. Basically, the security feature is that it is security hardened, means that when you are accessing through internet, in addition to having TLS connectivity, it only allows you to connect to um, basically the RDP or SSH port. So you cannot really try to hack into a Bastion server. And on the other hand, it also just connects to the private network on the other side and to retrieve your information. Um, so on top of that, you can actually, there are tools already built into Azure to monitor the connectivity to the Bastion server. Um, in addition to that, you can also actually configure um, your Bastion server uh, with RBAC to specifically who can connect to Bastion server. So you cannot just you can, but it is not advisable to give access to Bastion server to everyone or every admin. You only want to limit your connectivity to the administrators that will be managing that particular environment, and you just give the connectivity to those admins. And also you can add additional security features such as MFA and whatnot for those admins who will be connecting to Bastion server. So essentially what you are doing is adding another layer of security, and to break this layer of security to access your server is almost unheard of. I'm not going to use the word impossible because there's nothing impossible. That's why we keep on adding new security features. But I would say that all in all, since it is a hardened uh, server that is provided by Microsoft, you can be sure that this is very secure, and it does not allow any other incoming traffic from internet other than the RDP or SSH connectivity that you choose for connecting to the Bastion server. So with that, I have finished this particular module. I'll just pause for a second to see if there are any other questions. All right. So as we let the questions come in, I'm going to stop sharing. And before we break for lunch, I'll try to do a quick demo. Just keep in mind about creating Azure VNet, as well as we'll go over different option. So just keep in mind that sometimes these demos do take a little bit long because I'm actually configuring an environment. So just give me a moment. I'll stop sharing for a second, and I will come back with the Azure interface for you. Okay. All right, I'm back. And we're going to now look at Microsoft Azure interface. We took a quick look yesterday, and now we'll see how to configure a virtual network. So you'll go to all services. We can see here, but I mean, I'm just going to do a search anyway. So let's just say virtual network. Once you do that, you can see that there are a lot of different resources here. And so now I have the virtual network interface here. So I'm going to just go over this virtual network interface. I already created one. I'll show it to you later. As you can see, and there is a subscription, and there I already have a resource group. Okay, so I'll go over the creation of the second virtual network. Before do that, there is a basically, I think the question is like, can the logs of Bastion or anything can be collected to maybe a SIEM for security analysis? Absolutely. Microsoft does provide um, a Microsoft Endpoint Protection tool as well as SIEM-based tools for security analysis. And you don't actually have to collect logs to feed it into SIAM tools. It is automatically done. So when you subscribe to the service, you can add, um, basically you're going to add your network or your environment to the Microsoft Endpoint Protection services, and then basically it is going to do your network analysis for you. So nothing manually, you don't have to feed information. So let's just go over. So I already have a subscription and then resource group. Let's just say I just created my resource group called my group one, and I'm calling this VNet 2. Next, I'm going to create a IP address scheme. So can just do 10 dot, sorry. right? So as you can see that I have another address space that it is overlapping, so it is not letting me do, letting me add this, right? So I can actually choose this, the subnet that is address space and the subnet that is already created. Let's go to security. So as you can see, when you are actually creating this security, creating VNet, and this is what I mean by when you actually can have a lot of the security features by default. So you can actually enable a Bastion host, so it'll already be there for you in the network for this particular VNet. Okay, you can have the DDoS protection standard. Okay, if you look at that, it basically says that the DDoS protection plan is a paid service, obviously, but it actually mitigates the DDoS attacks for this particular virtual network. And also, as you can see, it already says that basic DDoS protection is integrated into the Azure platform by default at no additional cost. So basically, this additional feature actually uses telemetry data to do some deep level um, analysis of your network traffic and protect from high level of DDoS attacks. So this is more advanced, just in a plain simple term. You don't necessarily need it, but if you have some servers or that need additional features, additional protection, most welcome to do so. Let's look at the firewall option. Again, Azure Firewall is a managed cloud-based network security service, and it is also something that you can enable um, as a paid service. So let's just say we just skip all of these as is, and we move on to tags. So tags are again used. I think we talked about resource group tags. Um, Tags are again used to do either reporting and or let's say I call it network 02 tag. So it can be used for either reporting, or tags can be used um, for the purpose of billing. Sorry, I was looking for the word billing. All right. So tags, that is the most common usage of tags. You you may have some specific reporting you have to do, such as like how many hardware related virtual network or what have you created, or you can have a situation. The most common situation is billing. So in this case, as you already saw in the security, you can add additional features which incur additional cost. So you may want to add, like if you have enabled Bastion, you want to add like your tag 2 is actually Bastion enabled, right? So you don't actually, if you add this tag, so you don't actually have to, like, let's just say you have hundreds of virtual network. You don't actually have to go and uh, check the configuration of every network. You can just query for your tag to see which network has bastions. So things like that can be helpful. So, okay. So next you review and create. So as you can see, first it's going to do a validation. Since it validation passed, I will just do a create. And then it is going to be, you're going to go and see this. And this will be a good way to, okay, so it actually succeeded. That was quick. Sometimes it does take long. So let's just go to the resources. So my resource group is resource group 2. And then I have, basically I have the network VNet created here. And as you can see that we have not configured any peering. Um, Filter network traffic to and from Azure resources. It's already done. DDoS protection is not configured yet, uh, but it can be configured. I can also configure private endpoint. As you can see that, so how is it going to communicate? By default, it's going to use Azure provided DNS service. We'll talk about that. And I can also basically configure flow timeouts and few other things. Here are the tags. As you can see, I configured the tags. I can do other tags here. In terms of settings, I know there were questions about what are security features and stuff. As you can see, like you can go and look at the address space and whatnot, and you can add additional address space that is not necessarily secure. You can look at the bastion, and you have not, we have not create bastion for this VNet, but we can, and we'll look into a VNet that has bastion. uh, we have the we have the basic DDoS protection. We can actually enable it for standard or the paid service. um, then you have the Microsoft Defender for cloud, and this is what we were talking about, that if we enable Microsoft Defender for cloud, it gives us additional security features. So it gives you all the features that you're seeing here: cloud security and posture management. So basically, any type of regulatory requirement that you have. So, for example, financial organizations have regulatory requirements. Government organizations have a lot of regulatory requirements. Those templates are already built in. You have workload protection for different machines that are connected, and you also have advanced threat protection that includes protection specific to storage accounts and SQL servers. As you can see that there are a lot of different security features. We have these um, are always great information to know. So I will highly recommend you to check all these. However, um, for this particular exam, I just want to make sure that we all understand that for this particular exam, detailed security features are are not in the play. So you will have to know the basic security that comes with Azure VNet, as well as the security features that are offered by Azure, but you don't have to dive deep into the security features and security related questions. There is a different exam for that. So this is VNet 01 that I configured earlier. This one actually has a bastion, but the bastion is not actually configured. So it has my bastion. I just created it when I did that, but I don't have any virtual machines. We'll do it later. But if I did have virtual machine, I could connect that virtual machine to this uh, Bastion 01 server. Then, in order to access that virtual machine, I'll always have to connect using my Bastion. And here I can do the authentication type with username, password on how to actually use the authentication. And as you can see, there are other security measures I can also take. So that sort of concludes the demo here. We will break for lunch, and we will be back. I think 1 p.m. Eastern is a good time. So we'll be back at that time. Thank you. All right, everyone. We are back after our lunch break. And before we dive into presentation, I just wanted to quickly show the peering, VNet peering that we talked about. So when you go to the Azure interface and I go and I choose my virtual networks. So I have two VNets here, VNet 1 and VNet 2. I go to VNet 01, and this is the VNet that I created previously. And then what I'll do is I'll select peering. And since there are no peering, I'm going to add a new peering. Let's just say I'm calling it peer 01. And I am looking at the traffic here. So you can now configure traffic to remote virtual network, allow, and or you can block all traffic. And also traffic forwarded from remote virtual network, you can allow or block. As you can see that you can also use remote virtual networks gateway or routing server or none. Um, for remote virtual network, you can give another peer. So let's just say I say remote peer 01. And you can use the resource manager model or classic. Um, the biggest difference is, as you can see, select the deployment model you wish to pair with. Basically, this one connects via your resource manager, and classic, you have to do further configuration. So, and with this, I'm choosing my subscription as the one. It is already selected. And since I'm in VNet 1, obviously it's not going to let me to pair with myself. I'm going to choose VNet 2. And then as you can see, I'm just choosing the default ones, but you can actually configure based on what you want to allow or not allow, right? And then you can also choose a virtual network gateway or route server. So in case you are using a network gateway to enter into a completely different environment. So, and then I just create add, just like I did before. And then what happens is that it will do a validation and successfully enable it. Since I didn't add any gateways remotely or not, we can see that the gateway transition is disabled. So very easily we can add peering in the virtual between two VNets. So let's now dive into the presentation. I'm just quickly going to stop sharing for a second as I load my presentation. So let's talk about Azure VPN Gateway and ExpressRoute. In our previous discussion, we talked about how Azure provides us a way to connect the virtual network with other virtual network, and it can be within the same resource group and different resource group or different region. We also talked about how you can use a Azure VNet can connect to your on-premise network should you extend your on-premise network to the cloud or vice versa. And that is accomplished by using Azure VPN Gateway. And ExpressRoute also is another alternate solution that we're going to talk about. So the learning goal for this module is to implement VPN Gateway and ExpressRoute. Just to be clear, we are going to talk about and touch base on VPN Gateway and ExpressRoute. Now, these two topics are actually covered in detail when you are in if you're in exams such as hybrid exams AZ 800 or AZ 801. Not to say that these are not covered by Azure Administrator exam, but those two exams actually are focused on these features because these features are very important for a hybrid environment. So there is could be a little less focus on these features for this particular exam, but nevertheless, you should know the basics. So, what does a VPN gateway do in Azure? It provides, just like any VPN, virtual connectivity to a virtual private network. When you are setting up the VPN gateway, it will ask you for different gateway type, and you're going to choose your gateway type. Then you have a different types of connectivity type, which can be site to site connectivity, point to site connectivity, VNet to VNet. So even in between VNet, you can create a VPN gateway. It is not really required, or I cannot think of a reason on top of my head, but it is possible to create. Then you have site to site and point to site connectivity. Site to site connectivity is what is referred to as two different sites, which is uh, the way we describe your on premise site versus your cloud site. And that is the connectivity type you're going to choose when you're creating a VPN gateway with your on premise environment. When you choose to create a VPN gateway with your on premise environment, basically what you'll be doing is that you'll be creating a virtual VPN gateway in your virtual network in Azure. But with your on premise environment, you'll have a device, a networking device, or an existing device that has VPN capability with your on premise network. Because keep in mind that on premise network, we are assuming that you have physical networking devices. So, like we mentioned, that when you are creating a VPN gateway in the cloud environment, that is in Azure, you're going to setting up your VPN gateway or a virtual network gateway that connects with your on-premise environment. So the steps are that you are going to first, obviously, you're going to select your subscription, and then you're going to have a name. You're going to choose your gateway type. As you can see that here, the gateway type is VPN. You have a route based or policy based. Basically, what that really means is that your traffic is going to be based on your route, whereas in policy, you are going to create a specific policy to route your traffic. So policies can be related to your security. Then you're going to choose a SKU. So basically, you can choose different SKU for different types of services that you get through Azure. Generation actually really what that really means, again, it's related to type of service that you get from Azure in terms of Gen 1, Gen 2. So in this case, in this example screenshot that is sourced from Microsoft site is Gen 2. And then you're going to choose your virtual network as well. Um, for public IP address, you're going to create a new IP address scheme, and you're going to choose if you want to have any active mode or if you want to configure BGP. You have to create your on-premise device, as well as you have to create your local network gateway for your on-premise before you can connect to on-premise environment. Let's now briefly look at Azure ExpressRoute. We talked about VPN network. Now you can also actually use Azure ExpressRoute. In our previous connection, we saw to connect to your on-premise environment or to connect to other environments as well. So Azure ExpressRoute is a really special service in the sense that you have to basically use a Microsoft partner to connect to Azure ExpressRoute. There are Microsoft partners who have already, as the name implies, these are networking partners who have partnered with Microsoft to have a private network that actually directly connects to Microsoft Azure and other Microsoft services such as Office 365, Dynamics 365, as well as Microsoft Azure Public Service. So basically, this connectivity is already there. As you can see in the diagram, there's partner edge where you connect to, but the internal network of the partner has a connectivity with Microsoft Edge server, which directly connects to Microsoft services, including Azure. So, what that really means is that you will create a basically a VPN gateway that actually connects to partner's edge. And basically, you're going to pay the partner for this particular service. However, this is going to be a completely private connection, and it basically not only it can provide additional security, but it with this one connectivity, you are actually connecting not only to Azure virtual machines and all your VNets and application, but you're also connecting to Azure service, not Azure services, Microsoft services such as Office 365, Dynamics 365. Um, so you have also express route circuit that is primary and secondary, so it provides you redundancy and high availability. Of course, with VPN, you can set up your own availability, but it is just adds more complexity to your environment. Here, all you are doing is basically connecting to a partner network, and the partner basically takes care of rest of it, and the connection is highly reliable, and it's also directly connected to Microsoft Edge. The only downside is, of course, like it costs a lot more, and it is justifiable when you have a larger environment and you are subscribing to multiple resources within Microsoft. To summarize, in this video, we covered VPN gateway types, and we also covered the basic steps of creating VPN gateway in Azure. I'm just going to pause here for a moment and stop sharing where I load my other presentation. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please feel free to post your questions. All right, I'm back, and basically, I will start with Azure Firewall. Before starting, there's a question about if Bastion hosts uh, if it's a potential severe security risk. Bastions are not a considered a security risk simply because these are hardened servers and you already have security features enabled, assuming that you are already have security features enabled to log into the server and you're only allowing admins to log into the server. So of course, like in just like anything else, we cannot just say that you deploy Bastion and they are secure. Keep in mind that if in the worst case scenario, your Bastion gets compromised, basically it's always the idea is that you can always just simply get rid of it, right? Um, and that which is true for any jump server or anything like that. What you want to make sure is that um, by compromised, what I mean that if someone do manage to hack into it and try to install something or perhaps like use that as a jump point to go into your application server. So that is something should not happen if you deploy enough security measures. So again, I believe that Microsoft does have like a 4 steps of security. So there is one. Step one is for the first day you get any Microsoft service, what you are supposed to do. And the first thing they also always say is that is to make sure all your administrative accounts are secure. So make sure that you only allow administrators to access your Bastion, and also make sure that you do multi-factor authentication and you are monitoring risky user usage for your security administrator, and you are doing the um, just-in-time access as well for all your administrators. And again, like we are not going in detail about those security features since those are not part of the exam syllabus, but as long as you follow the Microsoft security guideline in terms of securing your admins and how to use the Bastion, the security risk is really minimal. So with that in mind, let's move on with Azure Firewall. In this particular module, we will talk about Azure Firewall Service, and with that, we will talk about key features of Azure Firewall. So Azure Firewall is a Microsoft managed service. As you already saw when we were configuring the VNet, we can subscribe to Azure Firewall. And basically, it is a paid service that you can purchase from Microsoft. Azure Firewall is used to protect resources within the virtual network from any threats. It maintains high availability and uptime. So you don't have to worry about is your firewall up or is if it is available, because with physical firewall devices there is always a chance of downtime, which you don't have with the firewall service. It also supports threat intelligence, which basically means that the traffic that is hitting the firewall, even if the traffic is not allowed, based on the pattern of traffic, it can recognize if it is a threat and it can take appropriate actions. If nothing else, also it can turn on alerting and give you a intelligent information as in someone is trying to basically hack into your system. So this threat intelligence is extremely important because you'll know the target, because usually, you know, if there is a threat to your environment, the threat is targeted against specific servers or even specific users or specific users' workstations. It also integrates with Azure Monitor that we'll talk about in upcoming chapter, and it will log event with Azure monitoring service. So based on those events, you can also set up your own alerts. So, I mean, with Azure Firewall, based on it gives you uses threat intelligence to give you alerts, but you can set up additional alerts. For example, like you already know that, there shouldn't be more than, um, you know, 10 connectivity attempts to your SQL server during this time of the day, or there shouldn't be any connectivity attempts to your SQL servers, during off working hours. So you can actually, instead of blocking the connectivity during those hours, you can set up alerts if somebody is trying to connect. So Azure Firewall has a premium service. The premium service features are TLS encryption. So what that really, let me just rephrase that. One of the service is TLS inspection. What that really means is that the data that comes in with TLS encryption is decrypted at ingress point, and it basically processes the data and re-encrypts for egress transition. And this allows for by doing the TLS inspection, basically, not only you can do a higher level of security, but you are also ensuring data integrity. It also monitors, logs, and reports on the network, what is happening in the networks. So basically, if what we mean by funny business here is that if there is like a slowness, or if there are any types of um, environment that is down, if there are any, it's causing too many hops to jump through to reach to your certain application, those are also logged using the Azure Firewall premium service. It does URL filtering, because it does analyze the entire URL instead of just the domain name only. As far as web application concern, you can configure allow or block based on the content. So, for example, you can actually configure sports, gambling, adult content. So, block those content based on the content type. You don't have to add all those websites. You can create exceptions, use these rules with higher priority. So for example, if you are, let's just say you are blocking all the traffic from any other international, let's just say UK, all the traffics that come from UK, but you don't want to block any traffic from, let's just say, certain banks, because your organization has banking relationship with those companies, you can create exception. So when you create exception, you have to make sure that the exception rules have a higher priority than the block rules. Otherwise, it will not work. To summarize, we talked about firewall. It is a managed service provided by Azure, which basically means that you don't have to set up any devices or anything. It is just a service that you purchase. You can do your own configuration within the firewall. There are obviously built-in rules already built in within the firewall. It is guaranteed 99.99% uptime. There are threat intelligence, as we talked about. What that really means is that it recognizes certain pattern of traffic and sends you alerts. It is compliant with all the regulatory standards. As a matter of fact, there are templates and standards that you can choose. There's also, on top of the Azure firewall service, there's also the premium firewall service, which does have additional features such as TLS inspection, IDPS, URL filtering, and also you can choose web traffic based on different categories. I'm going to pause here for a moment. to see if there are any questions. All right, let's start with our next chapter, which is Azure DNS. We referred Azure DNS, and we saw that when we configured our VNet, it is using Azure DNS. So let's talk about that. So in this video, we'll talk about Azure DNS, what it is, and we'll also talk about what you can do with Azure DNS, the key features. So DNS, just to recap, is domain name naming service. It uses TCP. So basically, it translates your IP address to a name that you give to your server. This serves essential role of translating your domain name, for example, www.cybrary.com, into a known IP address. IP addresses are required for network to traverse through network any communication. So all your computers, networking equipment use the IP addresses. However, we understand everything using domain naming service, hence the requirement for DNS. We essentially need a way to record which IP address belongs to which name. And that is the entire purpose of DNS. So Azure DNS is the Azure Managed Domain Hosting Service. It hosts records for the domains that are purchased from third-party reseller such as GoDaddy or any type of similar services. Azure DNS also supports all the DNS management services located in VNets and also related scenarios. So the DNS will support records such as A record, CNAME record, MX record for Exchange, name service record, pointer record, SRV record, and all the DNS records that you see. Azure DNS, just like any other Azure services, are highly available, and it uses the Anycast service for efficient delivery to end users and services. So basically, it is already built in, and what you do is that you have the option to just choose Azure DNS for your communication. So what that really means? So what it really means is that it will become a little bit more clear, I think, when we look into the virtual machine chapter. But when you are adding a virtual machine, you're going to give it something like, my VM01 name. If you are in a Cybrary domain, so your organization is cybrary.com, so it'll be myvm01.cybrary.com. That is the fully qualified domain name. So when you create that VM, this domain name gets entered in the Azure DNS automatically. So you don't have to set up a DNS server. If you recall, those who are familiar with on-premise environment, you have to set up a DNS server, and then you have to point your workstations and all your other servers to the DNS server, and then you have to basically, when you introduce a new server or new workstation there, you have to make sure that the entry gets automatically updated in your DNS server. So here in Azure DNS, it's already there. Whenever you create a new virtual machines or new resources, it gets added. So in this chapter, just to summarize, we introduced you to DNS and DNS management in Azure, and we also talked about just the features and capabilities of Azure DNS Server. The key thing to keep in mind is that Azure DNS server is aware of all the resources in Azure, so it may not be it is not aware of the resources that you are that are available on premise. So in those scenarios, you still had to maintain your DNS servers on premise. Let's now talk about Azure Load Balancer. I'm just going to pause for a second to load the presentation. All right, let's talk about Azure Network Load Balancer. We're all very familiar with network load balancers in our on-premise environment or just networking in general. When you have networks and different subnets and your different network devices, you want to make sure that your traffic is balanced in the sense that you're not getting all your traffic in one particular network or network interface. It is balanced. So that is where the load balancer comes to play. So let's look at load balancer in terms of Azure. We will talk about implementing public facing load balancer in Azure. We'll also talk about internal load balancer. And last but not the least, we will talk about load balancer rules. Before diving into load balancers, let's look at different Azure network traffic services that Azure has. First, network traffic service is application gateway. This is basically optimizes your traffic to application server. We will touch base on application gateway. Then you have Azure front door service, which is basically a microservice. This is primarily used for web applications. We have load balancers, which is balances the inbound and outbound traffic. This is what we are going to focus on in this particular lesson. Last but not the least, we have the traffic manager that distributes traffic optimally for high availability um, for different applications. And I just wanted to make sure that I mention all of these different features. One key thing to remember when you are looking into these services, if you go to Microsoft.com, there are tons and tons of documentation. Let's just say Azure Front Door Service or Application Gateway. For this particular exam, when I say you need to know the basics, I really kind of like to emphasize that go back to the um, go back to the syllabus, go back to the exam content and see what is required. So one of the reason is like I'm not adding front door, let's say Azure front door traffic manager, is because it wasn't listed there. So it's still very helpful to know what those are just in case, but you don't have to know the details. And same goes for even something like application gateway, which there are like many different complex scenarios, but you don't have to go to the nitty-gritty detail of like the specific app and how application gateway works. You have to know the basics for this particular exam. So before we dive into load balancers, let's look at a question. It's actually related to DNS. What are the best practices to secure the DNS in Azure against any attack? Since Azure DNS is really internally managed by Microsoft, you really do not have to worry about securing, because there is absolutely no access to the actual DNS server. Um, no one, even you, cannot access this. It's all automatically managed at the back end by Microsoft. So that is the good thing, that as long as you're securing your environment, such as your VNet, your virtual machines and whatnot, you don't have to worry about somebody attacking the Azure DNS, because no one has access to Azure DNS. So let's move forward with load balancer. We are first going to talk about load balancer um, on the public side. What that really means, that a load balancer in Azure is used to balance the load, incoming load that comes in from the public facing network. This load can be from TCP port, let's just say port 80, let's just say you have a lot of web traffic. This will map the public IP address and port number for incoming traffic to your virtual machines, um, private IP address and port number, and vice versa. So it will also apply the load balancing rules to distribute the traffic across the virtual machines and services. So you'll create the rules to say that how to balance the traffic. And we will look at the load balancing rules in few seconds. Let's now look at the private load balancer. Um, Private load balancer will direct the traffic only to resources inside a virtual network or a network that uses a VPN across different Azure infrastructure. So for example, here you can see that you have basically you have a load balancer across your SQL servers. And basically this load balancer is balancing the traffic from different workstations that are also in Azure. So with this internal or private load balancer, the front end IP addresses and the virtual networks are never directly exposed to an internet endpoint enabled load balancing within the virtual network. So for cross premise virtual network, for multi tier application, and for line of business applications, basically you will not have an issue where your internal traffic is your internal IP addresses. In this case, the internal IP address, let's just say your of all your SQL servers being exposed. The load balancer is there to basically giving you a virtual IP or VIP. It's standing in front of your SQL servers. So for example, your workstation in this particular diagram, if they're exposed to public facing network and there's public traffic, basically that traffic, if that traffic is directed towards SQL, it has to go to the load balancer first. So configuring load balancers. So basically, what are the steps of configuring load balancers? First, you have to create a load balancer backend pool. As we just saw, the backend pool can be your set of SQL servers or applications. Your configuration option will depend on the SKU. There is basic SKU and standard SKU provided by Microsoft. You also have to um, use then you define which where this load balancer associate to. So it could be availability set. We'll talk about availability set in detail when we talk about virtual machine, but in our example it could be a virtual machine scale set like what we saw, or it could be a single virtual machine. But these are the components that you have to basically configure. So you have to make sure that you have basically you have considered for this. One thing to keep in mind that the basic SKU has virtual machines in a single availability set or a single virtual machine scale set, but a standard SKU has any virtual machine in a single virtual machine virtual network. So, including it can have a blend of virtual machines, availability sets, and a virtual machine scale sets. So, multiple virtual machine sets. So, depending on what you have, so if you have multiple virtual machine sets that you want to associate your load balancer back and pull to, you need to have standard SKU. So let's now look at the load balancing tools. Again, a screenshot that we sourced from Microsoft. Load balancing rules will map a front-end IP and port combination to a set of back-end pool and port combination. Rules can be combined with network address translation rules as well. A network address translation rule should explicitly be attached to a virtual machine or a network interface to complete the path to the target. So, you have to make sure that it is basically the traffic is going somewhere. So, just keep in mind the difference between the network load balancing rules versus NAT rules. Remember that this approach should only be used, the combination of two, be used when you need connectivity from the internet. In most normal communication, um, this would occur from on-premise to Azure connections such as site-to-site VPN or ExpressRoute. So in those kind of situations, you actually do not need to have NAT as well as network load balancing rules. So here we are looking at just the diagram of load balancer configuration. Um, So as we already know, the load balancer will direct the traffic only to resources inside the virtual network or that uses a VPN to access the Azure infrastructure. The front-end IP addresses and virtual networks are never directly exposed to the internet endpoint, and it enables load balancing within the virtual network for cross-premise virtual network or multi-tier application or our application that are for line of business application. So with this particular network load balancer, this is really the way to balance your traffic and also ensure security. And as you can see from the diagram, you will create the load balancer rules in the NLB's basically backend side. So that is where the rules will apply. To summarize, in this video, we covered network traffic distribution options. We talked about public facing NLBs in Azure. We talked about balancing the internal traffic and NLB rules as well. So I will just pause for a moment before starting the next presentation. All right, I am just pausing for a second before loading the next presentation. Just give me a moment. All right, let's talk about Azure Application Gateway. As I mentioned before, if you are looking into application development and giving access to application that you created, custom application or any third-party application where you expect a lot of traffic, then Application Gateway comes to play. In the context of this particular exam, Azure Application Gateway, in my opinion, does not need to be delved into a lot of detail, simply because this particular exam is not really application development focused. However, Application Gateway is very important in terms of overall Azure management, which is why we need to know about it. Again, I'm just sharing this detail to with you simply because I don't want you to spend a lot of time exploring Azure Application Gateway, because there is a lot of content around applications and how to provide access and how Application Gateway works with different types of network and different types of traffic. So those are not necessarily applicable for this exam. And again, I cannot emphasize this enough. Please review the exam syllabus and make sure you're aware of it. But for this particular exam, we will go over the basics of Application Gateway. All right. So we will delve into what is Application Gateway and in the scenarios that Application Gateway are applicable. So basically, we'll talk about implementing Application Gateway. Right. So what is Application Gateway? What does it actually do? So, Application Gateway routes traffic to a pool of web servers based on the URL of a request. The web servers can be Azure Virtual Machines, Azure Virtual Machine scale sets. It also can be Azure App Service and even a on-premise server. So, the whole purpose of the application gateway is basically to control the traffic of a web app request. So it's really simple for the web traffic that is going to a server. So if you have a scenario where actually you are an e-commerce company and you're hosting your e-commerce website in Azure and you want to control the traffic, then the application gateway can be a good resource for that. So let's look at the basic architecture. As you can see that it will map the application gateway maps the public IP addresses and port number of incoming traffic to the virtual machine's private IP address and port number. And it does the reverse for the traffic in the reverse direction. So basically, it sits between your virtual machines in Azure and a browser that a end user is using. So then it will map the traffic um, for your internal pool. And when we said rules here, basically we are assuming that you have created some rules in firewall or within your application for incoming HTTP or HTTPS traffic from the web. So let's see how to set up the application gateway uh, traffic. So basically, what happens is that a front end IP and port combination will be mapped to a set of back end pool and port combination. You can have you at, and then you're going to set up some rules, and the rules can be can be based on the traffic that you are expecting in your application. You can have port defined in your listener for SSL offloading, and your listener can also have certificates, as you can see. The web application, in between your web application, you can have firewall where you'll have the firewall rules, as well as you can have health probes, basically that monitors the traffic to your application. So this is just a very high level overview, but these are the components that are involved, um, components that are involved in application gateway. So one question is, if application gateway is not central to the exam, as to why would you need it if you already have load balancer? So application gateway is basically, I would define it as a special type of load balancer, um, specific to web traffic. And that is really the features of application gateway, how you can distinguish it as from a load balancer. So um, it is not really it is not really that different, but it is worth mentioning because, as we already know, that when you are hosting applications in the cloud, in many cases, I don't know the exact percentage, but most of the applications that are hosted in the cloud that are expecting incoming traffic from the public side of the network is really a web traffic that is expected. So in those type of scenario, application gateway is more specific to web traffic, and that is why it is there. If I mean, basically, I'm if application gateway is not centric to the exam, I'm still curious as to why would you need it if you already have load balancer. I guess if the question is directed like, do we really need to know about it for the exam? We do need to know about it for the exam, just what I mentioned, that these are the components and this is a special type of load balancer that is required or that is offered by Microsoft. We don't really need to know, for example, you know, you don't really need to know how you are going to set up the different rules for this specific type of application that you created, all this kind of stuff. You don't need to go into that detail, but you do need to know some of the basics because it could be part of a question. All right. So, in summary, we talked about application gateway and its usage, and we also talked about some of the basic components of application gateway. So, yeah, I know that this can this can raise some questions as to like why do we really need to know this, since we are not really, this is exam is not really directed towards application developers. Like I mentioned, is that as Azure administrator, you have a broad range of things that will be part of the administration process, even when you are collaborating with other peers in your administration work. So that's why it is good to know all the basics of all the components. There are certain components that are very essential, such as just networking basic components, such as VNets and your network peering and stuff. And then there are application gateway type of components that are more applicable to perhaps the application development team, but you still need to know because you'll probably have full admin access to those components. So I will just take a very brief couple of minutes of break and I will be right back. All right, I'm back. And we are just going to focus now on network monitoring tool. And the network monitoring tool provided by Azure is Network Watcher. So our goal is to introduce you to Network Watcher, and we will talk about some examples of what we can do with Network Watcher. So um, Azure Network Watcher provides you with a set of tools to monitor, diagnose, and view different metrics related to your network. And you can enable or disable logs for different resources in the virtual network. The network watcher is designed to monitor and repair the network health of infrastructure as service. In case you are wondering, infrastructure as service, what it really means is the infrastructure that you have, such as your virtual machines, virtual network, your different application gateways, load balancer, everything with related to related to infrastructure as your service. The network watcher does not work with platform as service for monitoring or web analytics. So here are some of the use cases for network watcher. Network watcher will monitor the communication between virtual machines and other endpoints. For example, it will monitor the connection between a virtual machine and a specific domain. It will also, you can also view the network resources in a virtual network and their relationship, and diagnose the traffic between different VNets and how the traffic filtering is actually working using the network watcher. Unfortunately, I don't, it's very difficult to actually showcase the network watcher with a test environment because I don't really have a like actual traffic. But I'll try to collect some screenshot if I can tonight, and then if possible, I'll share it tomorrow. Because I think it'll be very helpful to have an actual experience, but it's one of those things that is hard to do in a test environment. So when you subscribe to the Network Watcher service, it is basically auto deployment with your virtual network. Um, So it does not necessarily cost anything to the for additional anything additional to deploy the network watcher, and it does not impact the performance of your virtual net or network resource. So you are just basically, this is a service that you already have with Azure. So in summary, we talked about Azure monitoring using the Network Watcher. We talked about different use cases of Network Watcher. There are, if you have any deployment or performance questions, let me know. As I said, like I'll try to get some screenshots and discuss those tomorrow if I can find some. So with that being said, we have completed all the presentations related to Azure networking, and that is what we planned for day 2. If you have any questions, let me know. Before concluding day 2, I would again like to go to the practice questions one more time and see. Let's just check out the network related practice questions. So I'll load those. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please keep posting. All right, we are back. Um, I have, before we dive into the questions, I have a question here about Microsoft Power Fundamentals, which is, I'm guessing, if the question is about how does Power Fundamentals relate to this certification. I'm just trying to find the Microsoft certified Power Microsoft Certified Power Platform Fundamentals, which is, I'm trying to find the, okay, got it. All right, which is PL 900. So just want to make sure that that is actually a different certification path. Um, I'll try to go over the certification path. There is a big PDF document in Microsoft that gives you different certification path. But long story short, the Power Platform certification path is completely different and not related to AZ 900 or AZ 104 or any Azure administration certification path. So it is not related. How does Azure relate to Microsoft Power Fundamentals? So uh, uh, I don't know if you mean Azure as a technology is related or Azure exam, but I can just say this Azure exam, this is not related to Power Fundamentals. Or is it an unofficial precursor to fundamentals AZ 900? It is not. It's just two different, completely two different paths. Just like Office 365 certification is completely, this like a completely different path. It's not related to Azure certifications. Even though technology-wise, they were all. I mean, the entire Microsoft Cloud is Azure Cloud. So technology-wise, it's all hosted in one cloud, but certification wise these are different specialty, therefore different certification path. So with that being said, let's look at, we are going to Cyber Vista, and we have a quiz for today. I just did configure and manage virtual network, and I'm going to do 10 questions, and let's just launch the quiz. All right. So basically, this is good. Like this is the type of question also you can expect. This is just to give you a glimpse of the practice questions that you can get using Cyber Vista, which is available through Cybrary. But you can use any practice questions. The key thing to remember here is to practice is to have practice questions. um, just have a look at practice questions before you go for exam, because oftentimes, unless you have worked the practical implementation of all the technologies we talked about, it is difficult to kind of visualize the questions that you're going to get in the exam. So I think that it's always a good practice to practice some exam. So let's see what is saying. So you're the administrator of the New Text Corporation. You want to monitor and troubleshoot your external network through Azure Network Watchers VPN troubleshooting. Which gateways and connections are supported for Network Watcher troubleshooting? Move each gateway, VPN, or connections to the type of column uh, that is whether it's supported or not supported by Network Watcher. So I like this question format because this is really something you can expect in the actual exam. I cannot guarantee that, obviously not, probably not this specific question, but this type of drag and drop, right? So what is supported and what is not supported? Let's just say I'm thinking the ExpressRoute is not supported. Maybe VPN client is not supported. Um, what do Network Watcher can do, right? Um, all right, think think I've done everything. So what happens if I do try to do two? Okay, that's good. Okay, it does let me do get it done like that. So if I do this, okay, I think what happened was, all right, let's go previous. Uh, all right, let's just go to question bank. Um, all Sorry about that. I'll do again custom, and I'll check these, and I'll check these two features I think are very important when you do. So let me just do 5 questions for this demo and launch the quiz again. All right. Um, Yeah, so I think that I'm just sorry if I seem distracted, but I'm just reading the response to the previous question. So there was a previous question about, is there a correlation? I'm just paraphrasing. If there is a correlation between Microsoft Power Fundamentals, AZ 900, and this particular exam, and my response was that Power Fundamentals is a different track, and the learner kind of responded back saying that not necessarily, his question is not necessarily exclusive to the exam, but in the field, because there are similarities between Power Platform and Azure. Of course, because everything you see in Microsoft is hosted in Azure. So Azure does provide the platform, even the services such as Microsoft 365, your Power BI, Power Platform, Power Fundamentals. Then you have your Dynamics platform. Everything is hosted in Azure. So obviously, there is correlation and similarities and a lot of features that you'll see um, that correlate all these technologies. So absolutely, there are similarities, and I would say that you'll only benefit from learning Azure, at least the Azure Fundamentals and Azure Administrator. Those two, I think, should be core for any Microsoft professionals. And then if you are hyper focused on building, Azure related, just Azure infrastructure, right? Like, let's just say you're building virtual machines, you're creating VNets, you're building the infrastructure. Then you focus on AZ 305 Azure Architect certification and related to that. But if you are O365, then you go to O365. But let's just say if you're managing Office 365 or Microsoft Power Platform, is AZ 104 helpful? I think 100%. I think that you should go for AZ 104 certification, even if you are focused on Power Platform or Office 365. All right. So going forward, let's just look at the questions. Nutex Corporation has began migrating resources to Azure. The corporation has systems that must contain working that must continue working and whose communication should be a direct connection from on-premise data center to Microsoft Cloud. Encryption of connectivity is not necessary. Which solution should you use? Okay. We know that we are not doing load balancer or anything like that. So I'm just going to choose this. Okay. Looks like this is correct. So I'm not going to choose correct answer every time. I'm not claiming that I know the correct answer, but I'm just giving you an example. Like, even when you choose the correct answer in Cyber Vista platform, it shows you why your answer is correct, right? You would choose ExpressRoute because this is the service that enables secure direct connection from on-premise to Azure. You already know this because we just talked about it in ExpressRoute presentation. You would not choose Azure Load Balancer or Application Gateway because they just load balance, right? You will not choose Traffic Manager because it enables just distribution of traffic across application endpoints. Those are the explanations. Let's look at the next question. And then this is another type of question that can be a little bit like challenging, I would say, right? Which of the so you have set up a virtual network that that is required to make these applications work seamlessly. Okay, so I guess the applications are to web, web to database, something like that, right? Now you are tasked to implement security measures to filter traffic. You have multiple virtual machines, virtual networks to manage the web and database tier. Okay. You have applied an NSG, but you want to simplify the manageability of NSGs. You plan to add many more virtual machines and rules in the future. So you want to use application security groups. The following is a screenshot of the rules in the NSG. So these are the rules that you created. Which of the following should you use to apply ASGs quickly and effectively? We have not actually talked about ASGs, but application security groups are also another important topic in terms of how you can use it using NSGs. So application security groups are basically grouping of applications that can be used with NSGs. So will you create ASG for each web and database management? Let's just say I create this and add NSG rules and add this. Okay. All right. Let's just see, check answer. All right. So looks like modify NSG rules to substitute NSGs. Okay. So so again, this is, I want to kind of like go back to the question format. This is one of the things that I think that the benefit of going through the question bank is that you're now seeing a different question format. Here you have something that is in most cases a bit harder than a multiple choice question, where you have multiple answers and you have to choose all that apply. Usually the way the scoring works, at least in Microsoft exam, at least what it says is that you get so in this case, let's just look at my answers. I actually didn't even read all the answers, so just but I just chose these three, but I got one wrong, right? So what would happen, I got two correct, but I will not get full point deduction for it, right? I will get 2/3 of the point because I got 2 out of 3 correct. So this is also something to keep in mind while you are doing the exam. So if you have, let's just say this one, something like that, maybe you're not familiar with ASG and you don't know. Still, I would say like review the questions and give as many correct answers as you can, because you do get partial points. All right, you're the administrator of Nutex. You want to find out following: which network traffic hotspots are producing most, and the list inbound, outbound traffic. Uh, which network traffic hotspots are more conversing to host pairing and deployed Azure network. Where in Azure Network Watcher can you enable a feature that delivers this kind of information? So this is where maybe a network watcher, basically if you have the network watcher application, if you look at it, that would be helpful. So basically you're trying to look incoming and outgoing traffic. Is it packet capture, diagnostics log, flow log settings, IP flow verify? So for to answer these questions, again, what I said was that let's just say we do the diagnostics log. It was flow log settings. Okay. So for this type of questions and stuff that we talked about this, but we didn't get into this deep level. I would say that I would recommend that looking into the resources, and also just to go to learn.microsoft.com, and then from there you can search for AZ104, and then just go through the content there. There is lot of content, but they have selected content that applies to AZ104. So It is kind of difficult to cover everything in this presentation. So this is another one of those questions that highlights the fact that not everything is covered in the presentation. This is very high level presentation. So I would suggest that to know this level of detail, just utilize some of the resources such as learn.microsoft.com. So again, this is what kind of information. So let me read the question. You are an administrator of Nutex Corporation. You must implement and manage virtual networking, configure endpoints on subnets to improve security of your resources. What kind of information do you need if you want to allow traffic from on-premise network through ExpressRoute for public peering or Microsoft peering? So do you need the NAT private IP address or okay, this one didn't have that explanation. Okay, so NAT public IP address. So basically in this case, it'll be NAT public IP address and it gives you the explanation as to why. What I was going to highlight that in the actual questions, I haven't seen multiple choice questions with two um, two options, but in the actual questions, you can have this question as a true false. So you can have that uh, the only information that you need for on-premise network through ExpressRoute for public peering or Microsoft peering is NAT private or IP address, and then the question will be, is it true or false? I think that that usually if there are two options, that is how questions are formulated. This is again our favorite question about left and right, and you have to do it in a correct format. You're the Azure administrator. You need to search port scanning and virtual. The company should maintain seamless RDP and SSH across your virtual network. Consists of you have two VMs, server 1, server 10, and server 11. So this is about Azure Bastion. Which steps should you perform? Place the appropriate steps. All right. All right. I'm just choosing a couple of options and doing that. Um, okay, that one did not have. Okay, that was weird. It did not have a or maybe I did not. Let me see if I can go back. Okay, I was not. But anyway, I was hoping that it could be that I clicked something incorrect. But anyway, the point I was going to make is that that is also another thing. In addition to questions being drag and drop, you can also have drag and drop questions where you have to set up step by step in a perfect order. So keep your eyes out for those type of information too. Whenever you see steps, as you are reviewing the content, just pay attention to order of steps whenever you're trying to configure something. So with that being said, we did our questionnaire demo, we did some networking demo. So I will conclude day 2. If you have any questions or anything, let me know. I'll hang out here for a couple of more minutes. Other than that, we'll see you tomorrow.